Hello, Minnesota historians. Today we're going to be talking about World War One in Minnesota. Now, we're not actually going to probably talk much about the fighting that was going on in World War One. We're going to talk about some of the things that were going on in our state during World War One, and there were some interesting things going on. Now, first of all, about 1,432 Minnesota soldiers died in the trenches fighting over in France um, during World War One. So we sent many soldiers over there. However, many soldiers did not return. More than that, though, died either on military bases in the U.S. or on military bases in other parts of the world. But we had over 2,000 die of flu, the 1918 Spanish flu. That Spanish flu actually started in Kansas. Why did it get called the Spanish flu? Because so many people were dying in Spain that it seemed like, well, it must have started in Spain, but we've now pretty much traced it to Kansas. It was a swine flu, it was a pig flu. Um, just like they talk about how this particular flu that we're dealing with now probably came from bats. The flu pandemic of 1918 most likely came from pigs. So in total, we had 3,758 soldiers die. Some of these soldiers that died, they got on a train, they left their hometowns, they got to a military base, they got sick with the flu, and they died. Never even really, they just started training. Never even went over to Europe, never even got close. So kind of crazy thinking about that. Now, when World War One broke out, Minnesotans were very patriotic. Now, it took a couple years for the U.S. to get involved in the war, but by 1917, when we joined the war, Minnesotans start to change some things. Some changed their German names; they didn't want to sound German. Some things got changed, like sauerkraut became known as Liberty cabbage. Things like hamburger became known as Salisbury steak. So things like that. You can see this is a photograph from Hutchinson, Minnesota. You can see a couple little kids outside. The king of Germany was known as the Kaiser. You can see the little guy with the sign, "To hell with the Kaiser." This was the St. Paul building in Minneapolis, and it is, I think it's Minneapolis. Maybe it's must be St. Paul. It says St. Paul, but for some reason I thought it was Minneapolis. It used to be known as the Germania Bank, and when it was first built in 1894, it was the tallest building in St. Paul, and it was 8 stories tall. They do think during the 1920s, or a little bit before, yeah, 1921, I believe, F. Scott Fitzgerald rented a room here and started writing parts of or stories that would become The Great Gatsby. But anyway, it started off as the Germania Bank and changed names a few times. And by 1917, they start taking down some of the sculptures, like the statue of Germania and some of the other sculptures on the building, because, hey, it's representing Germany. This was a guy in Laverne, Minnesota, in southwestern Minnesota. 32 residents tarred and feathered him and dropped him off in the South Dakota border and told him not to come back. Now you think, well, what is tar and feather? Well, they put the hot tar on you, then throw feathers on you, and it doesn't really come off because that sticky hot tar can burn into your skin. So when they do start to peel that off, it rips your skin off and can cause infection. So people have died from being tarred and feathered. So there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in our state. The Minnesota National Guard was sent down to New Mexico to Camp Cody in 1917, and there were a couple different reasons why the United States was having our troops train in New Mexico. One of the reasons was that telegram from the German ambassador Zimmerman had been intercepted. It had been sent to Mexico, and they were telling Mexico if they attacked the U.S., then they would give Mexico back a lot of the land they had lost during the Mexican-American War. And so Mexico wasn't going to do that, but we thought not a bad idea to send some troops down there anyway, just to have a big presence on the border. The second reason was the outlaw, Pancho Villa, was attacking towns on both sides of the Mexican American border. And so you could have some troops down there kind of protecting that area. When the when our first American troops and when our National Guard was training down there, we became, or our 34th Infantry, 34th Sandstorm Infantry down in New Mexico, took the symbol of like a bull skull and a red one on like a cooking pot, and that became kind of the symbol for our 34th Infantry Division, and their nickname is the Red Bulls. And still today, you can see it. Here's one from recent wars: 34th Infantry Red Bull Division. You can see the drum. It looks like they're in Iraq, I believe, with this stuff back there. So that's how they got their name. It goes back to World War One. Today, the 34th Red Bull Infantry Division provides training and readiness oversight for 10 National Guard brigades with a total of more than 23,000 soldiers across Minnesota. So many of you probably know somebody that is part of the 34th Infantry, or was. Here, I cut this out of the New Prague time capsule. A letter was received at this office from Albert Chechka, who was at the Great Lakes Naval Station, stating his appreciation of the old home paper. He also says, and I wish to add that after my 10 or 12-year absence from New Prague, I have never felt more proud of my old town. So you got that in there. He's stationed somewhere. And then down here, of the many sad deaths occurring from the epidemic, that's the 1918 flu, prevalent in the country, one of the saddest was that of Matthew O'Keefe, who was heeding the call of Uncle Sam, left with Scott County's contingent on October 23rd for Camp Cody, New Mexico, was taken ill on his journey there and died on November 6th, leaving a bride of scarcely a month. Minnesota women did not enter factory work at the same rate as women in other parts of the country, and a lot of that was we had a lot more agriculture, and a lot of women were doing agricultural work on the farm while their husbands or sons left for war. We did start seeing a lot more women join like the Red Cross during World War I. There was the Army of American Housewives. They were urged to conserve in nearly every area of household life, whether it's making clothing, making scarves, whether it is cooking. You can see some of this stuff. Corn, the food of the nation. Serve some way every meal. They wanted us to be eating corn so that the wheat and flour could go overseas. We've learned about the Nonpartisan League, and if you recall, they were that third party. You had the Republicans, you had the Democrats, and you had the Nonpartisan League. And the Nonpartisan League was pulling people from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And the Nonpartisan League was for the farmers. And the idea was they were going to help the farmers in any way possible. The main thing they were looking to do was for the state to take over flour mills, railroads, banks. They wanted no privatized banks, railroads, flour mills, etc., because they were kind of ripping the farmers off. And they thought, well, if they can make them private or public and the government runs it, the price of everything will be lowered. And so the Nonpartisan League was for the farmers. Now you think about the government taking over private businesses. That's what we call communism, socialism, where that's what the Russians did. That's what they did in Eastern Europe after World War II, is they took people's farms from them, they took people's businesses from them and made them part of the government. So even though the farmers are very much for this, a lot of the business people are very, very much against this. World War I stopped the momentum of the Nonpartisan League, basically kills it in its tracks. What did we see during World War I? The king, or the king of Russia, the Tsar, was overthrown, and they turned communist, and people lost their farms, people lost their businesses, and the government took over. And so basically Americans are like, we don't want that to happen here. And so that kind of kills the nonpartisan league. But there was some trouble in our state during World War One. You know, we talk about fascism. That's where people don't have a choice. That's where you have other people deciding things for lots of other people. Um, you know, if you are not part of the majority, you're going to lose a lot of rights, that type of thing. So we saw what might have been fascism in Minnesota in 1917, 1918. And then some people might say, no, that's what we needed to justify, winning the war. So this would have been what we would consider fascism. Was the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety was created in 1917 to manage the war effort. You know, our National Guard is gone. They're off to go fight in the war. So they create this to kind of drum up some new troops. They drum up about 7,000 of them that are going to kind of keep order in the state. The other thing, though, that the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety did is they targeted workers and farmers. So by workers, we're talking about people that might want to try to go on strike. That was a no-no. The Minnesota Public Commission said miners up on the Iron Range, factory workers, people working in the flour mills, you absolutely cannot go on strike. We will put that down. And on the other side, the farmers supporting the nonpartisan league, they went after the farmers, and they did not like the farmers. J.A.A. Burnquist was the governor at the time, and he was the guy that was going to kind of appoint this committee. There's a guy, I can't remember his first name, but his last name was McGee, and he kind of ran this committee, and basically almost like a dictator. They set up a network of spies, secret militia. So here's Burnquist, governor from 1915 to 1921, started the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety to suppress any discontent with World War I. So basically, your freedom of speech is going to go out the window here. And we saw this before where he talked about it. There's two types of people, two parties. There isn't a Republican Party, there isn't a Democrat Party, there isn't a nonpartisan league party. There are loyal people, loyal Minnesotans, and disloyal Minnesotans. And so if you were against him, he said, you're disloyal. You're against the war. We're trying to win it. So the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety did some other things. They distributed food. They helped control the prices of goods and conserve fuel. When the fires happened up north around like Cloquet and Moose Lake, hundreds, if not thousands, of the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety went up there to help the people. So they were doing some good, absolutely. They're probably best known for their secret surveillance, though, of different towns that they thought maybe there are spies in there, German spies. They intimidated people, whether it's workers at the factories from going on strike, whether it was the nonpartisan league. Um, they used extreme tactics, and they said, we're doing this for your own good. We're doing this to protect Minnesota's citizens. Why were they created? Well, Minnesota was a state that had about 70%, so 7 out of 10 were either immigrants or the kids of immigrants. So you think about that. Okay, um, back in 1917, I know that the first Schenecker that moved up to Union Hill, well, he was dead, but his kid was still alive, so he would be one of those 70%. And of course, my great grandpa was alive too, but he would be considered a second generation American, the second one born here. So the German Americans made up the largest of this 70%. You know, back in 1916, Woodrow Wilson, the president of the United States, came out and said, I don't think the German Americans, the German people that moved here, will ever be able to assimilate into American culture. Some of you are Germans. You've been able to assimilate into American culture. So Woodrow Wilson was wrong about that. And that's important to think about as people think about maybe new Americans, people that have come from other places, and people, they'll never fit in. Well, they said that about the Germans. The Germans fit in just fine after a while. So people were really worried about the Germans. If you would have went to New Prague in the early 1900s, and sat down in school, they would not have been teaching you in English. They would have been teaching you in Czech. If you would have went to some neighboring towns like Jordan or Belle Plaine, you would have been learning in German. And then by 1917, they outlawed that throughout the state. The Commission of Public Safety said, no, you're going to teach everything in English from here on out. Any non-citizens had to register their property and report family data. At this point, this was still an era where you could move to the United States and live here and not be a citizen. All right, and people were doing that. I mean, late 1800s, early 1900s, you could just immigrate over here. Probably go through Ellis Island or whatever, and you did not have to be a citizen ever. You could live here the rest of your life. When your kids were born here, they could be they were automatically citizens. But a lot of people just never filed the paperwork to become a citizen. It was much easier to immigrate to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s than it is today. So the Nonpartisan League was holding meetings all over the state, and the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety encouraged communities to shut them down, by any means necessary. So remember, Charles Lindbergh Sr., that's the father of the guy who's going to fly across the Atlantic in 1927. He was the candidate for the Nonpartisan League, and he faced resistance. He's actually going to run, even though he's a Nonpartisan League member, he's going to run for governor as a Republican, try to, he's getting Democrats and Republicans on his side. And they faced a lot of protesters at a lot of different campaign stops. New Prague would be one of those places where he would have a difficult time running because in New Prague, most of the workers worked, or their husbands or whoever worked at the flour mill. So most of the people had a connection to the flour mill in town, and that paid their employees fairly well. And they were being told by the owners of the mill that if the government takes them over, like the local nonpartisan league wanted them to, then their pay would be cut. And so they were very against the nonpartisan league. Minnesota business leaders supported the move. They were happy. They didn't want strikers. They didn't want people going on strike. So they were all for what was going on with the commission. They created a 7,000 member armed militia. So these guys weren't being trained by the government. They were being trained by the state of Minnesota. So kind of almost like a little secret police. Anybody that spoke out against the government lost their jobs. They could be assaulted, that type of thing. These guys would march around. Like I said, they did do some good. Fires up north, they went and helped out with that. They would hire Pinkerton detective agents to attend a lot of the meetings in different German towns around the state and kind of basically be spies. The worst of it occurred in New Ulm in 1917. They asked the government not to send German Americans to fight in World War I, or they said, please don't send them to the front lines. Remember, a lot of these Germans had just gotten here. Maybe there's one generation, or they were saying, well, basically, I might be fighting against my cousins over there, or second cousins, or you never know, relatives, old neighbors. And so this is New Ulm. You might be driven by it, but they have a statue of Herman the German or Armin the German. So lots and lots of proud Germans in New Ulm. They've got the restaurant down there, the Kaiserhof, and New Ulm is a very German community. Newspapers around the state labeled the New Ulm people traitors. They had a very respected doctor who was their mayor, and he was removed as mayor by the governor Burnquist. And so basically there was trouble in New Ulm. All around the state, the local newspapers, I'm sure New Prague, same, was just with them, was, hey, these guys are traitors down in New Ulm. They won't send their boys to go fight in the war like the rest of us are. There was a little trouble in New Prague. Now, up around Union Hill, there were 124 Union Hill farmers that signed a petition to boycott in New Prague. They basically told the mayor of New Prague, when we come to town, we're not being treated very well by the people. And if that doesn't stop, we're going to boycott your town. Well, the mayor of New Prague wrote a letter back to the Union Hill farmers that said, Jordan and Belle Plaine have stores too. So basically, he's saying New Prague doesn't want your business. These Union Hill farmers were members of the Nonpartisan League. They wanted the railroads and the flour mills and the grain elevators and the banks to be taken over by the government. When they were harassed coming into New Prague, the police didn't do anything. The Union Hill farmers, they supported Lindbergh in the nonpartisan league. New Prague supported Burnquist. In the primary that June, New Prague voted 320 to 5 in favor of Burnquist. So only 5 people in New Prague voted for Lindbergh in the primary. Now there was some trouble even before that, before the vote. A famous court case, at least in New Prague, probably around that time, Robic versus Suckamil. It occurred May 25th, 1918. Burnquist came and spoke in New Prague. He riled up all the people, probably spoke poorly of Lindbergh and the nonpartisan league. Most people in New Prague attended. And there was a local farmer, William Robic, who supported the nonpartisan league, and his banner that he had was torn down. And when Robic was in town later to attend a meeting, he got roughed up by Tom Suckamel in an altercation that occurred at Nikolai's Saloon on Main Street. Today, this is Nikolai's Saloon would be known as what's it called? It's the tattoo place with oddities and everything. Used to be a bar, but it had been a bar for a long time. But now it's a tattoo parlor and coffee shop. Anyway, this is where that occurred, and these guys all beat the heck out of Robic and pounded on him pretty good. So it goes to court. Robic said he was attacked by 5 men. He was beaten up. He was made to kiss the American flag and sent home. The 5 men said, "Oh no, we were acting in self-defense." So anyway, the defense attorney was all fired up, and he said, "Hey," he said, "during a time of war, rules regarding free speech should be suspended, and if somebody's going to talk like that, we should be able to make a football out of Robic," meaning kick him around a little bit. Anyway, each of the 5 men were found guilty, and they had to pay $1. And so in today's money, that's $17. So each of those guys had to pay $17 to Robic. So he made a little money on it, but not much. Lastly, the flu of 1918, and we're going to go a little bit more in depth on this just because of the current times that we're living in. We'll have some readings and stuff on it, but the flu of 1918, it was certainly a little different than what we're experiencing now. It had a higher death rate, and the other thing that we see, though, is that it killed people in the prime of their life, and so you had they think like older people had experienced a flu similar to it earlier in their life when they were younger, and so they were kind of immune to it. But it was people, teenagers, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds that were keeling over and dying from this. Said people would be fine in the morning and dead in the afternoon. Across the world, about 50 million people died from this. More than 500,000 people died in the United States, and we had about 12,000 people in Minnesota die from the flu. And the crazy thing was, it was young people dying, right? That was the scary part. This influenza. You would get the high fever, the chills, you'd be coughing, you couldn't breathe, and people were dying. So the young people were affected the most. Around New Prague, we had around 25 deaths from this. Like, you're talking the New Prague area and a couple miles in all directions. We had about 25 deaths. Well, the population in New Prague was maybe only about 1,500 in 1918. So now think about that today. Okay, 25 deaths in about 3 months, 4 months. How big is that? Well, times that by maybe 5 today. And all of a sudden now we're experiencing 125 deaths around New Prague in a few months span. And these aren't 80, 70 or 80-year-olds. These are people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. That would be shocking to open up the New Prague Times every week and see, 3 or 4 people dead of influenza in the prime of their life. There were no airplanes that people were flying around the world in. What helped spread this around the world? How did it come out of Kansas? You're talking about trains and boats. The scary thing is today with diseases is airplanes, we can travel around the country, around the world very quickly and spread this stuff. So you can kind of see, like, you might go through cemeteries and look and see dates of 1918. It especially was hard on, like, you think of the soldiers that are in those trenches or in the barracks. You think about the people up north that suffered through the 1918 fire, and they really were kind of packed into places together because their homes were all destroyed. And so they kind of hurt a lot of those people. Businesses and schools across the state were shut down. We're seeing that, right? Public meetings and gatherings were banned. We're seeing that. Certainly, places that shut things down um, sooner and longer did better than places where people came back out. So schools in New Prague. We're not talking the necessarily the state, but this was in stuff, maybe parts of New Prague, or parts of the state in New Prague, but in different parts of the country they had different things going on. But schools were shut down for 3 weeks. Saloons were shut down for 2 weeks. Churches for 1 week. So we've already seen a greater amount of stuff being shut down today. All right, we'll have some additional readings and stuff like that on this stuff later.